Okay, this is going to be the last lecture going into the second exam. We're going to finish up the female reproductive system, talk a little bit about pregnancy, talk a little bit about development during pregnancy, and then the end of this will be it'll be the last lecture and the last handout that will be on the second exam. This is how the human egg is often deceived, where you've got sperm going, package for you to sign for, ma'am. Phone repair man, need to check your lines, ma'am. Insurance salesman, ma'am, mind if I step inside? It's it. Just can't trust them. So, a developing embryo implants in the lining, and between the two sides, a placenta gets built up. The mother side is contributing almost all of the resources, pretty much all the resources, but the embryo side is taking those resources and building stuff with embryonic tissue. The mother side is building stuff with maternal tissue. And I mentioned earlier, there's 3 different ways to build a placenta. You need materials to get from the mother's blood into the embryo fetus blood. And you can do that by having the placenta be full of blood vessels from both sides. You can have it have no blood vessels and just have it be a big spongy thing, which involves the blood mixing. And immune system responses become a really big deal in a situation like that. We do it somewhere in the middle, is that the mother side is basically a big sponge. Blood goes in, kind of oozes through, goes out. The embryo side is in blood vessels. So the blood there is a membrane barrier between the embryo's blood supply and the mother's blood supply. Doesn't mean stuff doesn't get through. There's a lot of leakage during a pregnancy, and there is a certain amount of tamping down of an immune response in the mother to the embryo's antigens, because the embryo is going to have some markers on its cells that don't match mom's. Some of those can be potentially dangerous. One of the things that we've been finding in the last few years is that cells come across and can stick around in the mother's system for the rest of her life. Is that if someone was pregnant and you go hunting, you can find cells that are genetically the babies that just are there. Whether that means women as they get older are more likely to have immune system issues, whether that's connected to that, nobody really knows, but it seems like a fairly strong possibility that that is true. The lining of the uterus is going to get thicker. It's going to build up muscle. It's got to be able to push an eventual baby out of there. The cervix softens. It very early on develops a plug of mucus and tissue, because you don't want stuff getting up there from outside, and you're not sliding the lining off every month, so it effectively seals the system. Well, it sort of seals the system. It still winds up being possible. There are situations where ovulation doesn't completely stop, the signals get crossed that way. And so another cycle goes by and there's an ovulation and sperm gets into the system. And it is theoretically possible to have 2 embryos that are not really the same age, that were actually fertilized a month apart. They have to be delivered together. They wind up being delivered as twins, but they're not developmentally the same age. That also happens with regular twins, where sometimes one regular twin will mobilize a lot more resources than the other twin, and so they'll be different sizes. They won't be different ages, but they'll almost seem like they're different ages. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on in there. There's a lot of hormonal fluctuations. The pituitary is responding to the placenta releasing progesterone and saying to the pituitary, okay, we're busy down here, don't be starting another cycle. Sometimes, that works most of the time. There are times when it doesn't completely work. But there also, because there's a lot of mobilization, and an awful lot of mobilization of nutrients in the body is controlled by hormones. When we get to the endocrine system, we'll talk about that. There's a lot of hormone fluctuations, and hormones in a lot of cases have like multiple impacts, and a lot of them have impacts on your brain. So there's a tremendous amount of weird stuff that happens hormonally. Nobody really knows what the cause of morning sickness is, which doesn't hit everybody in the morning, doesn't hit everybody. There's all sorts of theories, but none of the theories really stand up when you go to test them. It doesn't really seem to be sensitivity to particular types of nutrients. It doesn't seem to be increased sensitivity to possible toxins. It just probably has a lot to do with us being a very weird interactive bag of hormones. And when a whole bunch of hormones are working together, you get odd side effects in some people. So what's also happening is the embryo is mobilizing nutrients that it has access to. It will send messages over into the mother's blood to mobilize things like calcium, to mobilize things like glucose. There's something called maternal diabetes, where the mother loses a lot of control over her sugar levels. Well, that's because the embryo in the fetus is basically tamping down the mother's sugar control so that more sugar can go across into the embryo in the fetus. There's certain vitamins that we don't store that are not really accessible for an embryo to say, give me that. I mean, if you're taking them in your diet, they'll take them. But if you're not taking them in, they will not. And there's certain very important B vitamins and other vitamins that if you're not eating properly or taking maternal vitamins, then the embryo will not build itself properly. Folate, a particular B vitamin, very critical for early development of the nervous system. And people that don't have the right levels of folate will have birth defects from having the embryo not being able to build its nervous system properly. For the most part, there's enough stuff in a regular diet for the embryo or fetus to get by, but it is tricky, and there is basically a fight going on for resources. One of your handouts talks about that. And no pregnant woman, when you say, man, you're eating a lot, and they go, I'm eating for two, none of them wanted to be pointed out that the thing they're eating for is only that big, which it is for a lot of the first trimester. It takes a while before it gets big enough to be really accessing a lot of nutrients. So things are building, literally, things are building. And so we're gonna work our way through to delivery. Hope you're taking notes. You notice I'm not writing a lot down. But by now you should be kind of used to how I talk and writing the important stuff down, so you can find it later when I ask you a question about it. I think this is. What gets delivery started? There's conflicting. Remember I said everything about human reproduction is there's disagreements about that. Whether it's some sort of feedback from the lining of the uterus, some sort of expansion or stretch thing. There's a lot of evidence that the embryo itself, or the fetus at that point, releases hormones that cause, there is a hormone released from the pituitary called oxytocin, used for a lot of things. Remember, hormones do a lot of things. But one of the major things it does is it induces the beginning of contractions. If you're well past your term and they want to induce contractions, they give you Pitocin, which is an artificial form of oxytocin. But and sometimes you get weird fluctuations that cause a false set of contractions, false, Braxton Hicks, I think they call it. But eventually, this baby is going to be pushed out. In that situation, it should be head down, because that's the biggest part of the baby to come out. And the baby is getting its oxygen and its nutrients through this tube into the your belly button, your umbilical cord. And if you go head first, then this stuff all squeezes through really easily, and the tube is fine till you're delivered, and then you pull the placenta off the lining of the uterus, and but by then you're out and breathing. If you go the other way, in some cases you can't go the other way because you're in at the wrong angle and it just isn't going to work. But a lot of times you may go butt first, or sometimes even legs first. But then your head has to follow, and this tube is going to get squeezed along the side of the head and pinched off for who knows how long. How long does the delivery take going down through the birth canal? You also run into an issue where if they do an ultrasound, they may find that the umbilical cord has managed to get itself wrapped around the baby's neck, in which case people think, oh, it's going to choke the baby. No, it's not. Baby's not breathing. But the baby is getting oxygen through that tube. And if during delivery it pinches down on the umbilical cord, like stepping on a hose, it can cut off its own oxygen supply. And that, of course, is dangerous. So it's not really choking the throat so much as choking the umbilical cord. So, but the baby should have turned onto its head toward through the last month or so. There are actually some cultures where they, the women of the village will actually, there's an old story about this I remember reading, where there was a missionary at this village somewhere in the world. And, you know, every once in a while a doctor would come by, you know, a Western doctor would come by and check everybody in the village. And the doctor was visiting, and the missionary went, they have these weird rituals for these pregnant women. They get this special hut and everything. And the doctor goes, what do you mean, weird rituals? And he goes, well, you know, when they get big, they, like, once a week or so, they go in there, and all the ladies of the tribe, they kind of gather around her, and they do this laying on of hands, like, you know, and, you know, it's just this weird ritual. And the doctor goes, they're making sure that the baby is turned properly before delivery. You can feel the baby, and you can, if you do it slowly over the course of the last month, you can make sure that the baby is head down so that you don't get complications from the birth being down, you know, upside down. And the doctor went, this is not, you know, some weird superstitious ritual. This is a very, you know, very useful medical procedure. They wouldn't call it that, but there's a reason why this has become the custom in some places where, you know, there's not a lot of Western medicine. And, you know, delivering a child is still one of the most dangerous things that a human being can do, a healthy human being can do. If during delivery or shortly after delivery, there are complications where the oxygen supply is cut off for various amounts of time. You get a condition that isn't really named properly. Here's the thing about a baby's brain. If we cut this blood supply off to our brain, the upper part of the brain is affected first, is that the part of thinking and memory and processing, because it's working really hard, it needs a lot of oxygen, and it's very sensitive to oxygen deprivation. An infant's brain isn't really doing that yet. So if you cut the blood supply off to the brain, depending on how long it is, it may eventually affect the cerebrum, but it's much more likely early on to affect the back part of the brain that controls movement, even though, you know, the movement control is still somewhat limited in an infant. And that's the cerebellum. And so when they call it cerebral palsy, in most people it's actually cerebellar palsy. It really doesn't have any long-term effects on the upper part of the brain, but it may have effects on the coordination aspects of the brain, because it's the lack of oxygen is actually damaging the cells, and the cells don't necessarily recover. And so it tends to have more coordination effects rather than upper level thinking and memory effects. If there's a long period of lack of oxygen, then it'll have all sorts of upper level effects as well. But it could be anything from a mild effect where sometimes you can just hear it in people's voices. That's a very complicated coordination thing that voices do. You know, up to people needing to be in wheelchairs or having issues with the thinking part of their brain. But it's considered a birth defect, but it's one of the rare things that's an at-birth defect, is it happens around the time of birth. It's not genetic, sort of. I mean, if the placenta has a tendency to tear off easily, that could be genetic. So you could find circumstances where it kind of sort of runs in families, but it's not really considered to be genetic. So then it's out. And we're mammals. We give birth to fetuses, and they're not capable right off the bat of feeding themselves. Some of them doesn't take long. If you've ever had guinea pigs, you know, they're eating food pretty quickly. But we do continue to give nutrition to our babies through mammary glands, through milk. And milk, if you think about this, it makes perfect sense. Milk has all of the nutrients necessary to keep building baby, because the baby's got to keep growing, it's got to stay healthy. So all the different things we talked about, the carbohydrates, there's lactose, it's a sugar. The carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins are all in the milk so that it can continue to build the baby until the baby can move on to, you know, to food that has its own nutritional content. Now, whether there's a really big deal between human milk and other kinds of milk has been a subject of debate for decades. Going back to my decade, is that it was really unusual for mothers to nurse when I was born. It was, you know, put them on milk, put them on formula. Formula wasn't terribly sophisticated at the time. Formulas now are a lot more nutritionally balanced than they used to be. But you see all sorts of things like, oh, it's bad for them, it'll make them do, you know. And I know if you look at the people in my generation that are running things, you might be able to go, well, you know, maybe it had an effect on them. But it doesn't really seem to have a huge effect of how you're supplying the nutrition. There's not a huge amount of nutritional difference between cow's milk and human milk and even goat's milk and other kinds of milk. And it is one of those areas of research where, because I've read a bunch of studies, and you don't need to read the studies, all you need to do is read their introductions and their design, and you know they're going to find exactly what they wanted to find when they started this study. So is it good? You'll find lots of studies that it's good. You can tell the first couple of paragraphs, that's what they're going to find. Is it bad? You can tell the first couple of paragraphs that you can design a test if you're not doing it the right way to find just exactly what you want to find. And this is an area where that happens a lot. I think I mentioned this, and I just mentioned the carbohydrates in milk are called, is lactose. And in typical mammal lifetimes, the only time you're ever exposed to lactose, which is two sugars bound together, you have to break them apart in order to absorb them. The only time you're exposed to lactose is while you're nursing. And then once you're weaned and you move on to other food, you don't ever get exposed to it again. So why would you make an enzyme to break those two apart so you can absorb them? And our ancestors, once they were weaned, they stopped making the enzyme to break lactose down. Now, my more recent ancestors, which have domesticated animals that we can get dairy products from, there's been a benefit to not shutting off that enzyme to break lactose down. So people from Western Europe, people from parts of Africa where they use horse milk, parts of Asia where they use horse milk, and cattle in parts of Africa and the Middle East as well, even camels in some places, is that it's an evolutionary benefit to be able to access that carbohydrate through your lifetime because it's available in the milk that we're getting from these animals that we've domesticated. So we think of lactose intolerance. Actually, lactose tolerance is what's developed in certain populations of people. And if your ancestors are from a part of the world where those types of animals were not domesticated and used, then chances are you turn off your ability to make lactose, which means it goes through you without being broken down, and it's kind of sticky for water. Some of the microbiome in your colon are kind of really happy with it. It has symptoms that are not pleasant symptoms if you're exposed to lactose and you can't digest it. One thing to kind of tack on to the end here, since we are talking about the female system, is menopause. The system hits a certain point and shuts down. What happens? Well, it turns out that the cells in the ovaries that respond to the pituitary signal to start a cycle get less and less sensitive to the signal. You don't run out of eggs. Your eggs are older and older and less functional, but you haven't run out of them. But the cells that are going to be the follicle cells in your ovaries, just they don't respond. And in some cases, the pituitary is expecting some sort of hormonal response when it sends the signal down. And so when it doesn't get that response, it does the hormonal version of screaming at the ovaries to do what it wants it to do. And so a lot of the hot flashes and all sorts of, there's a whole bunch of hormonal side effects connected to menopause that are essentially connected to the pituitary trying like crazy to get the ovaries to keep responding, to the point where when eventually there's no response at all, your pituitary will go, well, stop it, I'm not gonna do it anymore. And then you're no longer ovulating. Is that ovulations get very irregular, they get very well spaced out, they may continue and not have any obvious other effects in the system. So the menstrual cycle may appear to have stopped, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the ovulations have stopped. It's a tricky thing. Usually you kind of wait until everything settles down and then give it a little bit more time to be kind of sure that there's no possibility of there being a fertilizable egg cell in the system. But some of the hormones that are the ovaries are no longer making, the progesterone and the estrogen, are also involved in some nutrient mobilization, like calcium. So there's a definite association with menopause and thinning of the bones, osteoporosis. Your bones actually get more porous and thinner than they would otherwise be. Added calcium helps. Exercise helps, because the more you pull on your bones, the more your body's inclined to put calcium in your bones. They've tried various sorts of hormonal, boosting the hormones that are no longer being produced, but there are cells in your body that can be kind of nudged toward becoming cancerous if you throw too much hormones at them. And you get older, more of your cells are likely to slide that way anyway. So usually hormone boosting isn't something that they like to do anymore. So you just kind of ride through it. But the kind of shrinkage that you get in older women, the shrinkage of the pads in the backbone, you get this kind of bent over, what they call the dowager's hump sort of thing, all associated with this drop off in calcium metabolism. Okay, that is it for the section on reproduction, and that is it for everything going into the second exam. You've got a handout that talks about reproduction. That's going to be the last handout for the second exam.